Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and today I'm going to answer a very common question, which is what computer should I buy for photo editing or video editing? I'll try to address both questions as we go, though they are very different questions. And to do it, I'm going to be using my own personal computer as an example. And I'll warn you that this computer is going to be wild overkill. You don't need this much, but if you're a nerd, you might just enjoy checking it out. First, I'll try to address the question of Windows versus Mac, and I have to disclose that I worked for Microsoft for like 20 years. I wrote something like 30-something books about Windows. So I'm not unbiased here. I don't have any current connection with Microsoft except some of my books are still on the shelves, but I am a Windows guy. And the reason is that for the buck, you tend to get more power out of a PC. There's a little bit of an Apple tax that goes along with Mac. It's not that much though, especially nowadays, and Apple makes some really amazing hardware. So it comes down more to personal preference. If you're a Mac person, if you just find it easier to use, then go for it. But nowadays, most of the stuff you hated about Windows is gone. Windows is pretty stable. Use all the same apps. Lightroom works the same. Photoshop works the same. Premiere Pro works the same. If you're into video editing, being on a Mac certainly gives you a few more options because you could use Final Cut Pro, which is available only for the Mac. But otherwise, for the most part, you'll probably get a little more power for the same amount of money if you go with Windows. Up first, the disk, and that's probably the most important thing for both photo editing and video editing, especially in Lightroom, which is the one app everybody wants to be a little bit faster. Most of the time, it's bottlenecked by your disk. The disk stores files persistently. So when you import pictures from your camera to your computer, it's copying them all to the disk, and then every time you go to open up those pictures, it is to read them back from the disk. And if you have a slow disk, your computer is going to seem very, very slow, even though it's probably only the disk. For photo editing, for working with Lightroom in particular, or for video editing, especially 4K files, you absolutely need an SSD. So there are two types of drives available on the market nowadays. The old magnetic drives, which are the conventional drives, just a hard disk drive. They're literally these like plates of magnets that a little head can read, just like a record player basically, but a lot packed in there. Conventional drives are less expensive. They are also much, much slower. The newer generation of drives are called SSD or solid state drives, and they work exactly like the flash memory cards that you put in your camera. So there are no moving parts. They tend to be very, very fast for bandwidth first, which would be transferring a large file, like copying a 4K file or a huge raw file. But they're particularly fast at random access. So if you ask an SSD to read a particular picture from the computer, conventional hard drive will have to wait a little beat as it waits for the disk to spin around to that particular part of the drive and waits for the head to get in place. But that happens very instantly on an SSD. So everything just goes much, much faster. I find that I often can make a computer seem brand new just by upgrading the standard drive to the SSD. But for those of us into either photos or video, there's a big problem with SSDs, and that's storage space, because SSDs just don't get to be that big. Most SSDs that you find for a reasonable price are like 256 gigs, and you can fill it up real fast with even just taking still photos, but especially with video. I think the bare minimum size needs to be about 1 terabyte, and that's what I have in this computer. The main drive where Windows is installed, where my Lightroom catalog is, and where I edit my videos is on a 1 terabyte SSD drive, which you can see right here. You can see it a little more clearly on the back. These drives get about 500 megabytes a second of throughput, both in and out for reading and writing. And even though 1 terabyte's not going to be enough for me. So what I have to do is archive my stuff. So I use that drive as my working drive, and it's fast. And it means that I flip through pictures in Lightroom much faster than I could if I had a magnetic drive. But I would fill up 1 terabyte so quickly that I have an array of conventional magnetic drives here. And when I import pictures in Lightroom, they go to my C drive, the fast drive. And then every couple of weeks, I end up using Lightroom to copy those files over to my B drive, which is the collection of these big magnetic drives. So you see here I have 4 8 terabyte drives, and so that's 32 terabytes of storage in total, but I have them mirrored using storage spaces, a Windows 8 feature that kind of intelligently mirrors them, and I'm using a special file system called REFS, which helps to protect them in case a file gets damaged. You can go in and detect that corruption and fix it. That's been really important for me, and that's a lesson I've learned the hard way, because the extra protection against corruption is important, because I've had drives that start to get corrupted. And even if you have a backup, you probably won't notice that that data has been corrupted. And then the corrupted data will actually get backed up. So with this new file system, REFS, it's capable of detecting that sort of corruption and automatically correcting it. So I hope to save corrupted video and photo files in the future by using that. However, REFS requires that every drive be mirrored, and that means that for 32 gigabytes of storage, 32 terabytes, I only get 16 terabytes of actual usable space. Now you'll see I have a 5th magnetic drive down here, a 4 terabyte drive. That's an older drive that I use to back up my C drive here, my 1 terabyte SSD. So I kind of continuously run backups of that 1 terabyte SSD to that 4 terabyte drive in case that drive fails. It's only a matter of time before any drive in your computer fails. And I can't tell you how many emails I get from panicked people saying, my computer won't boot, where are my pictures, how do I get my pictures? And any IT guy knows the first thing you think is, well, you get them from your backup, but most people don't have backups and you will lose everything. Backing up to a local drive like this is a good start, but I also suggest you get a web storage service or a cloud storage service. Just Google that. There are a bunch of different services out there. They will take your files and copy them up to the web. They work great as long as you have maybe a terabyte or 2 of pictures, which will satisfy most people. If you have, I'm over 16 terabytes of storage now, so that's too much data for me to easily transfer to the web. It would take on the order of 6 months of filling my bandwidth upstream for me to be able to offload that to anybody else. So it's not especially feasible. But it's critical that you have an offsite backup. Local backups are good, but they won't protect you from fire, theft, natural disaster. So what I do instead is I regularly use external hard drives, and I back up all new files to those external hard drives, and then I basically give them to Justin. And Justin takes them to his house, where if there is he's far enough away that if the nuclear power plant next to me has a problem, he probably won't be impacted. If there's a fire at my house or a theft, I'll be able to go back to those files. So you need that offsite backup as well. I also want to give a tip about free disk space. Whether you have an SSD or even more so an older magnetic drive, it's important to maintain a certain amount of free disk space because drives get slower and slower as they start to fill up. With magnetic drives, it kind of works like a record player. And if you imagine a record spinning, the outside of the record is basically spinning the fastest, and the inside is spinning the slowest. So that first data that you write to the computer, your first pictures, are going to be written to the outside of the record. And therefore, the drive spinning at a constant rate will be spinning that outside much faster. That's why your computer seems to be much more responsive, much faster when it's new. And those older pictures residing in the outside of the drive will be easier to access, they'll be quicker to access. As you fill your drive up, you're writing in the middle. And that means it's spinning slower, and it's getting slower and slower. Part of the problem is that your drive is also filled up. So as you're writing data, the computer has to find little open spots in the drive to save the file. And that means that any one picture might be written at 10 or 100 different spots on the drive. With a magnetic drive, that means that it can end up taking a lot longer to read it. So anyway, long story short, try to keep quite a bit of free space on all of your drives to maximize performance. It's still an issue with SSDs, though not nearly as much. I just try to keep like 15% free on my SSDs and you should be fine. The next tip that's going to maximize your performance in Lightroom or in video editing is a USB 3 memory card reader. So many people have a modern computer with USB 3, but they're using a USB 2 memory card reader and it slows everything down. USB 3, USB is just the connection you use to connect your camera or your smartphone or your memory card reader or a hard disk drive, an external hard disk drive to your computer. So USB 3 is substantially faster. It's much, much faster. And any computer made in the last couple of years probably supports USB 3. There are those little ports with the blue in them. The older USB 2 ports are just all black. I highly recommend if you're looking for a new computer, make sure you pick a computer that has USB 3 and then get a USB 3 memory card reader. you're a desktop user like myself, I have an integrated memory card reader in this computer, but the one that it came with was USB 2. So even though it was built into the computer, it was connected internally with USB 2, and that meant everything was slow. So I had to go onto Amazon and buy myself an internal USB 3 memory card reader and then wire it through this computer to get the most performance out of it, but it ended up being really important. Now I'll talk about the processor in the computer, which is the next most important thing. After you have a fast drive, after you have USB 3 memory card readers, the processor is going to make the next big difference. This is my processor in here, and you'll see it's really quite buried under a bunch of stuff. The processor is what the computer uses when it's converting your files to a DNG. It's what it's using when you're making big adjustments, most of the time. When it's rendering previews, it's using the processor and the disk together really heavily. So upgrading your processor will make a big performance difference. And for that reason, when you're picking a new computer, I suggest getting the fastest processor that you have the budget for. And I'll talk in a little bit about different parts of the computer where you can actually save money. Because I'm not going to tell you just to get the biggest thing for everything. No, but the processor and the disk speed are areas where you do want to spend your money on. You can save your money in other ways. The processor is extremely important, and particularly so for video editing. Now, I went over the top on this, and you don't have to do that. I got the newest Intel processor, and then I also overclocked it. So that is an option nowadays. Moore's Law, for desktop PCs at least, has kind of been broken in the last few years, and new computers aren't that much more faster than older computers. So if you're not satisfied with that, overclocking has become a very stable and reliable option. This computer, which was custom built by a computer maker, has a water cooler on it. And that means that it can cool the processor more efficiently. You can take just about any processor and make it run much faster. The challenge is dissipating that heat, because if you run a processor faster, it'll overheat, basically. So you need something that's extremely efficient at moving that heat away from the processor and exhausting it. The water cooler here does this. That is, I think, a 3.3 gigahertz processor, and I typically run it at 4.4 gigahertz. So I'm getting about 30% more processor performance out of it because I'm able to use the water cooler and because the computer itself supports an overclocking system. The motherboard and the BIOS kind of define that. I picked a motherboard and BIOS specifically designed to support overclocking as well as the hardware required for it. If you go and you buy an off-the-shelf Dell, you're not going to get that option. You can sometimes overclock those computers, but they're generally not designed for overclocking. Alienware is one exception to that. By the way, all these rules generally apply to laptop computers as well. You want an SSD. Most of them will have USB 3 built in, and you want the fastest processor you can get. Memory, it very much depends on what you're doing. A lot of people just tell you to get as much memory as you possibly can, and I think that would be a waste of money. I find most features of Lightroom work just fine in 4 gigabytes or less. And this little laptop here only has 4 gigabytes of RAM, and I use it for Lightroom all the time when I travel, and it's just fine. Now, if you get into Photoshop, and you're working with a Photoshop picture, and you have, often when we do pictures that will have 20, 50 layers, you can get into a lot of layers and many different photos merged together. And at that point, you might need more memory. It's not uncommon to see Photoshop using 16 gigabytes of memory. Also, recently with Lightroom 6, they introduced the new HDR and panorama features. In monitoring the memory on those features, I find that they will use well over 4 gigabytes. They'll go into 8, 16 gigabytes. They will use all your memory if you go and create a very large panorama. So if you plan to take advantage of those features, I might recommend jumping up to 8 gigabytes or even 16 gigabytes. But if you're looking at a laptop and you're just doing casual editing in Lightroom, 4 gigabytes is probably going to be fine, and you can spend your money elsewhere. The monitors are one of the most important parts too. For me, as a desktop user, I prefer to have 2 monitors. So take whatever budget you have for one monitor, instead of buying that big, huge 4K monitor, buy 2 smaller monitors with that same budget, and you'll probably be much happier, largely because Lightroom is designed to work with 2 monitors. If you're doing video editing, applications like Premiere Pro are also designed to work well with 2 monitors, and it greatly improves your efficiency, I find. In laptops, where you might not have a monitor connected most of the time, I recommend getting the highest resolution monitor you can. The new Retina displays are becoming pretty common, and there are some 4K displays built into laptops, and that will make a huge amount of difference when working with Lightroom. When doing things like previewing your pictures and making sure that pictures are sharp, those extra pixels will make it much easier. It also leaves more screen space for tools in, say, Photoshop or Premiere Pro. So basically, pick two monitors whenever you have that option. The more resolution per monitor, the better, especially with laptops where you're traveling with it a lot. I think it's worth it to spend the extra money on a 4K or a Retina display. The new version of Lightroom scales really well to those higher end displays. Something most people misunderstand is the video card and the GPU, the graphics processing unit that's built into it. Now, your CPU here, the processor, is very fast and it can do lots of computations, but the graphics processor, the GPU, is many, many times faster at doing simple calculations. So applications such as video editing apps like Premiere Pro or Final Cut will offload a bunch of the work to the GPU, and that makes things go much, much faster. Now, Photoshop and Lightroom technically can offload some tasks to the GPU. Photoshop will do it only with some filters, when you're applying some filters. Most of the time, it does not use the GPU at all. Lightroom will do it, Lightroom 6 will do it when you're making some develop module adjustments. So you might see a hair in performance improvement when you're using, say, adjustment brushes and stacking many, many different adjustment brushes, or if you're doing some sort of transformation in Lightroom. For the most part, you're not going to notice the performance benefit in Photoshop or Lightroom. So if you're doing photo editing but not video editing, I recommend just getting the cheapest graphics card that can drive the monitors that you have. Do not pay extra for one of those Quadro graphics cards. They will not noticeably improve your performance. Basically, here's where you save your money. You get a cheap graphics card. If you're doing video editing, you don't have that choice. You want a big graphics card. This is a 780 Ti. But if you're doing photo editing, get the cheapest card possible. And a laptop, if they give you different options, the integrated graphics card is probably going to be fine. You don't need to spend extra to get the discrete graphics card. Again, you'll be missing out on that GPU offloading, but you probably won't ever notice. Put that extra money towards a faster drive, a bigger drive, more memory, bigger processors. I want to briefly mention the network. A lot of people I know use a wireless network connection, even though their computer is within a couple of feet of, say, their cable modem or their outgoing connection. Whenever possible, use a wired Ethernet connection. Not only is it reliable, but it's always faster than your wireless. It's confusing because the wireless connections will advertise being, 860 megabits or something like that, but that's almost never the case. In fact, typical wireless throughput is more like 30 to 60 megabits a second, even with the latest technologies, though it depends on a lot of different factors. A wired gigabit Ethernet connection is always faster. If you work in a team, as we do, and you're constantly exporting files between different computers, that wired Ethernet connection is going to make all the difference. It's also just more stable and reliable. Now, this particular desktop also has a wireless connection. This is the antenna for it, and I use that as a backup. So with my smartphone, I have the option for tethering. And this is the case with just about any Android phone or iPhone, though you might have to make a special service agreement with your wireless provider. I can turn on tethering here and then connect my computer to the internet through my phone using up my data plan. This is my backup plan for when my internet connection fails, because if you're like me, you have deadlines, you have work to do, you need to get the pictures to the client. You can't afford to not get your work done just because your cable modem provider failed for a little bit. So this is my backup plan, a wireless adapter in my desktop, and then a phone with tethering. Now I'll talk a little bit more about why I chose this computer specifically. This is not an off-the-shelf Asus or Dell or HP. It is a custom-built computer. It allowed me to choose a case. I wanted the largest case possible. So you can see I got a huge case, and that's because I have a lot of drives to store. Now, a lot of people will instead choose to use USB 3 external drives, and as they add more pictures, they'll just keep adding more and more and more. The USB 3 connection is noticeably slower. The faster drives also require an external power supply, so then you end up with all these separate power connections coming in. It ends up being very cluttery, and the cables can come loose and might get tangled up. Anyway, I just much prefer to have internal drives, so I wanted a case that had plenty of space. I've also run out of PCI slots before because in the future I might be adding more interface cards to support, say, a RAID array, more additional drives. I might even add a second graphics card in order to process those big 4K video files a little faster. So this computer leaves me room to grow. The large case also makes it much easier to work with. If you look at the motherboard here, it has enough SATA ports to support a ton of drives. Those are SATA 3 ports. My previous computer, I had an SSD in it, but the computer itself only supported SATA 2, and that meant it didn't take advantage of the drive's full performance. Instead of being 500 megabytes a second, it was running at about 200 megabytes a second. And I tried adding an SATA 3 internal card to it, but at that point it became bottlenecked by the speed of the bus itself, so it didn't actually improve performance any. To get the full performance out of an SSD drive, I had to upgrade basically the motherboard, so I decided just to buy a whole new computer. I do want to show off the back of the computer here because this has been an important feature for me. As you can imagine, with having 8 drives inside the computer, the cable management can be really difficult. The back of this computer has a lot of pass-throughs that allow me to pass the cables through and run them down the back here, channeling it to the actual drives. So that means the interior of the drive here is not incredibly cluttered with cables. Most computers are much more cluttered. Instead, all that clutter is in the back here, where it can be a little more organized. And you can see I've done things like use cable wraps and cable ties to keep the cables together, and I've upgraded it since I've gotten it, and not all of that is extremely tidy. But the tidiness that is there makes things much easier. This particular computer is also designed for ventilation, so the top vent here comes out for cleaning because it's going to gather hair. Just about all of the computer can be turned into a vent. There are a couple of nice features for system builders too, people who are tweaking and rebooting your computer. Like there are buttons inside of here that allow me to easily reboot it without having to move my body physically outside the computer. If you do this sort of tweaking, you know you're inside your computer quite a bit. So in a nutshell, this is not for the faint of heart. This was an expensive and custom built setup, and it's more than most people need. But it's not necessarily more than I need. And in fact, I'm still constantly wishing I had some kind of faster computer. Lightroom 6 bragged about performance improvements, but ultimately so many tasks in Lightroom are still extremely, extremely slow. You're making a panorama or even just comparing multiple pictures and opening up. I find myself all the time just frustrated that it's taking so long. I've done everything I can, gotten the fastest computer you can possibly build, and I know a lot about computer performance too. Some things are just slow. When it comes to 4K video editing, it's still not uncommon for one of our longer videos to take 4, 6, or 8 hours to render. Little changes are little things like adding like warp stabilization still kind of make the computer unusable, and it means I simply have to wait for it. So this is not overkill. It's underkill. I would get a bigger, faster computer if possible, and it would save us time and make us more productive. But in the meantime, this is about the biggest computer you can possibly get without going to more larger, like multi-processor type computers where you're looking at, well over $10,000 for the computer. So if you have any questions, add a comment down below. I bet you have some ideas too, you nerds. Write a comment with your suggestion and we'll take it into account. I hope this helps you build a good computer. To recap, SSD drives, absolute must, the bigger the better. Fastest processor you can get. And for simple things like Lightroom, 4 gigabytes of memory might be enough, but it wouldn't hurt to have 8 gigabytes or even 16 gigabytes. But save yourself some money and get a cheap graphics card.